Today we're here to talk about connector processing. If you're involved with processing your connector cubes on a nightly basis, this is something that will definitely benefit you in terms of some of the knowledge and figuring out what types of processing options are available to you for your connector process that occurs on a nightly basis. You can actually look this stuff up within the Viewer Help menus. So if you log into Viewer with the Help rotary here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that if you just hover over that rotary, you can get to the Help menu. The Help menu then comes up in a different session, a web, browser session. And at this point, it's just the general Help menu. But what you could do is search for connector, and it will go out and find the connector help for you. So the first topic here is the connector for viewer help. So that's exactly what you'd want to click on, and then it comes up over here on the main frame here. Okay. If I then just go ahead and click on what you get here, you can click on the open connector help. At this point, you're in the connector help. Okay. Today, we're talking about the different processing options that are available for the connector. So if we highlight that, or click on it, we can see in the main frame over here that there's an entire section here on working with processing. Okay. And you can print this off if you want to and keep this on your desk or file it away if you're more of a hard copy person. That's available to you. So certainly it's something that you might want to do. Okay, so what's going on with the processing? What's available? What things can you do to help your connector processing perform better? And how can it help you in certain situations restore the cube so that you're not down? So there are certain situations where you might have some errors or some issues with the cube or the process, and depending on the approach, your viewer system or your viewer environment might be down. So that's always a bad thing, of course. So let's go right over here to the Getting Started section, and we want to take a look at the introduction to the different types of processing that are available. So the help goes into all the different types of processing. You'll see the different areas up here of the different types of processes that are available. You have a full process, you have a standard process, you have a limited process, something called a trickle, a post, and a diagnostic. So we want to talk about each one of these and what they do, the different types of things that information that they provide in the log file, and why would you choose one over the other in terms of processing for your connector. And I think it's going to boil down to certain situations and requirements that you might have from your user community, no less. I have some customers that have users around the world, and it's important for them that viewers stay up 24/7 so that everyone around the world can enjoy the analytics of viewer. So in order to really kind of make that happen, there are certain types of processes that you can pursue that will allow you to keep viewer up and running on a 24/7 basis. So let's step right through in some of these different types of processes that are available. If we were to take a look at some of these the diagnostic process. So this is probably something that you will normally never run. It's very rare that you might run the diagnostic process. All this does is it goes out, it doesn't build the cube at all. Okay? So if you do a diagnostic, all the connector is going to do is retrieve information about your server. It's going to find out what operating system you're running, how much memory do you have available. It's quite informative about the server. The different types of CPU details that you have, and that's it. That's all that's going to do. And normally you'll get that anyway. You'll see a diagnostic section in most of the different types of processing, other processes that occur, it's still going to give you the diagnostic information. But it's you know, again, if you're not sure about what types of CPUs you have or anything else, it's going to typically be in your log file on a daily basis. But if you want to run just simple diagnostic itself, that's available. But again, like I said, it's not something, I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's typically not something that you'll do. What's a full process? Okay, well, the full process is typically something you'll run as an initial process. A lot of times when you when Sylvan comes on site or remotes into your network to install the connector, we will run a full process as part of the first process ever run. As a matter of fact, you have to. It's required. And a full process basically is a full build of everything that the connector provides in terms of the cube and the database. All the dimensions are rebuilt and reloaded from the different types of files that you feed, the master file tables, etc. Everything's refreshed and rebuilt. So a full is really a good way of just kind of, you know, stepping back and saying, okay, let's just make sure we have all of our measure groups are refreshed, and we want to make sure that the data is fully loaded and everything is reflected as needed. So again, always something that you'll run initially. And after that, it kind of depends on what you're going to do, you know, and how you're going to set up the nightly process. Just because you run a full process initially does not mean that you have to keep running a full process. As a matter of fact, running a full process is probably the slowest way to get your cube updated. Okay, so it's typically not something that you'd want to set up on a nightly basis. But normally, yes, something you would set up definitely in a development environment when you're making changes to certain things, or if you're reloading data on a given basis. You know, we run full processes all the time in more of a test environment. But in a production environment, like I said, initially during the install, you know, we're going to be running full processes. But normally when we set this up on a nightly basis, you're going to choose something else because something else would be quicker than a full process. Which brings us to the limited process. I'm actually seeing this being used more and more. And this is probably the more ideal process option to use on a nightly basis. It's basically a way to periodically update the data without interruption to the users. So the limited process, the full process basically kicks everyone out. So if you're running a full process, viewer is down at that point. There's no way that users can actually access and run views at that point when you're running a full process. However, when you set it up to run a limited process, viewer is up and running, so the users are not even impacted at all. They are able to run their views, and they will have no idea of what's happening in the background. So normally, and with that client that I was discussing before, the global client that has users basically everywhere, this is what we run. This is something that we run on a nightly basis, and it's probably one of the quickest ways to get the data updated because it doesn't refresh everything. It only detects changes and then processes things that have only changed, the data that has only changed. So for instance, for actual sales, typically your 2019 is going to change typically because you're always getting more invoices, new invoices that you're generating on a day-to-day basis are being updated into the 2019 tables. So the limited process at this point would only process the measure group of actual sales because it changed. And it can be even more efficient if you're running SQL Enterprise. SQL Enterprise provides partitioning so that it will even get more efficient. It will only reprocess 2019 as opposed to the entire history of actual sales. Either way, when you're running standard and enterprise, either way, this is going to be quicker than your full process, normally. It's kind of a wash, again, if you're not using enterprise SQL, depending, but this is, again, one of the other perks is viewers never down. A very cool thing about the limited process is that if it crashes or if there's an error and it causes the process to fail, guess what? Viewer is still up and running. That's another great part about the limited process is that if you do experience an error as part of the process, you're not down. And that's I think one of the best things about the limited process. So users aren't locked out, you're not down after a failure, and only things that change get processed are basically the takeaways of the limited process. It's a pretty good process. Now, if you're making changes, if you're renaming certain things and adding a new year to the connector, you do not want to run a limited. So it'll detect those changes and it will then tell you to run a full process. It won't automatically switch over to a full process for you. So if you're running a limited process, it's imperative that you are clued in and in touch with the application so that if you do make any changes, you change the processing type as needed so that you're not, the next day you're not, your environment's not stale. It's not a day old because at that point it won't run anything. So limited process is definitely a way to go on a nightly basis and is one of the quickest ways to get the viewer environment updated. Okay. What's the post process? A post process normally is always run anyway, depending on what process you run. Other than diagnostic, the post process is typically always run anyway as part of the full or the standard process. Looks like it's not part of the limited process either. And what the post process does is that it basically creates name sets for you. So it updates your name sets, and those are essentially just lists for your different year-to-date time periods. It creates any new calculated members, and so those are updated and part of the and available in your viewer environment. It imports Stratum Planner user lists into the viewer environment. So if you have a new user list that's been created in Planner, and you want to bring it into viewer, you simply have to just run a post process. You don't have to run an entire limited or a full process or anything like that. And that, as you can see, that affects the dynamic user list as well. So if anything, you have any new user list that you want to bring into the world of viewer, a post process would be the way to go without having to completely reprocess the environment. Any new Stratum viewer roles, again, something that that you can run a post process again. If you make any changes to the roles, you could run a post process, although it's not necessary. So again, post process here's another thing is that sometimes the connector fails on the post process. Does that mean you have to run an entire full or a limited or a standard process again? No. At that point, if you figure out why it failed and you're ready to restore it, at that point you only need to run the post process. You don't necessarily need to run an entire cube process because at that point the cube's already been built. Once you get to the post process steps, the cube is built at that point. It's just putting in value add components at the end, and that's why we call it the post process. So a lot like the diagnostic, this is probably not something you would run a lot. but it is something that if you were adding a new calculation or updating one, or user list, again, if you want to import those, this would be something that you could run without taking the environment down. Okay, and then there's the standard and the trickle process. The standard process is a lot like the limited process. It's only going to update things that have changed, but it doesn't give you the it doesn't give you that option of keeping users in viewer. Users are locked out during the standard process. Notice that the standard process does include the post process. So, a standard process would be something that I would probably run maybe on a weekend, and then you could run the limited process during the week, just to ensure that the post process is running and on a normal basis. So the standard process, again, is something that you'd probably run around on a fairly frequent interval, but not necessarily every day. And then there's the trickle process. The trickle process is interesting. This really kind of gets down to, what measure group do you want to update throughout the day? So the trickle process is very accommodating for instance, open orders, your backlog, inventory data. These types of data typically are more dynamic. They're changing throughout the day as you gain receipts for manufacturing, as you disperse data or units from your inventory. Inventory units are constantly fluctuating. And orders are always coming in, and you're always fulfilling them, and you're always shipping things out. So orders are always coming in throughout the day. So your backlog is actually shrinking or growing, depending, throughout the day. So how do we get that into Stratum? How do we get that data updated? How do we do that? And not only that, but what's the most efficient way of getting that done? And that's the trickle process. That's why we've provided this ability to update only certain types of measure groups. In this instance, maybe open orders and inventory are options that you'd want to do, or anything else for that matter. It doesn't necessarily have to just be inventory or open orders. If you have a piece of data out there that's changing throughout the day and it's critical for the users to get that data, well then, you certainly want to, use the trickle process perhaps to allow that to happen. Okay. So again, the trickle process is not going to run if it detects any changes. So just like the limited process, the trickle process, it's very important for you to be in tune with any changes that you're implementing periodically in the connector, so that the trickle process, is running after a necessary full process, depending on what was changed. The trickle process is normally kicked off by a command line, and there would be certain types of switch parameters that you would use to kick off the trickle process. One of those being, which measure group do I want to process? So that works out really well. Matter of fact, our new data copy feature in Viewer uses trickle processing to behind the scenes update, certain measure groups that you're copying data to. So, and that works out quite well. And we have several users or customers out there using the trickle process, indeed for those types of data, inventory and open orders for that matter. So again, a really important area of help here, I think, the introduction to the types of processes that are available within the connector. I definitely advise you to read through this and to really kind of digest what the information that you have here, and talk about it internally. Talk about it with some of your colleagues about what would best for you at your company. So if I go back, so that's quite a bit of information right there, just right in the intro. All right. and then there's this quick start. When do I use these different types of processes? So if we go into there, this is, again, just you want to just kind of spend some time to read through this information. There's a lot here, and it's very valuable information. So I think it's something that you would definitely benefit from. This table is great. As a matter of fact, I like this a lot. This is kind of going to tell you, why you would run a full. And like I said, normally we would run it for the first time, of course. If you change any of the metadata, any dimension names or measure names, are you adding or removing certain things like dimensions or measures? Were you just recently upgraded? You're going to want to do a full process as well. So again, as you can see, I don't have to run a full process all the time. This is just something that you need to run if the criteria need to be met. Full process, users are locked out, so users cannot run views. When do I run a limited process? You need to refresh the cube with changed data on a nightly basis with minimal interruption to users. And definitely something that you'd want to run typically on a weeknight basis. No changes have made to the metadata. And so basically this information, your environment's fairly static. There's no development things going on. Limited works well in a very static production environment. And we all love the fact that users can continue to run views while your data is being updated. So that's always a good thing. The post process, well, like I said, if you have any calculated members that have been changed or added, user lists that you want to bring in from the planner world. So normally that's something you would do on a post process. Users are locked out when running a post process. So keep that in mind. And that's probably why it's not part of the limited process. Standard, again, this would be if you want to refresh for any of the data that's been changed and then no metadata changes have been detected. Users are locked out. Okay. What I like about the standard process, however, versus the limited process is that if it does detect changes, it'll revert to a full process, whereas a limited process will not. So that's one little nuance, subtle nuance about the standard process that I do like. Okay. And then the trickle processes, again, if you have that little specific set of data that you want to update throughout the day without minimal interruption, without any interruption to the users, the trickle process is definitely something you'd want to set up. Now, if you want to, test some of this stuff out, I would recommend that you do that. As a matter of fact, you can always initiate the stuff. So if we look under the tasks area here, we can see how to initiate, how do I kick some of this stuff off? And it's basically going into the connector and clicking on one of these guys, right-clicking and doing it manually. There's also an area, so you can kind of read up on that, but there's also an area for batch command parameters here. You might be doing something from a command line, and you want to kick off, for instance, the trickle process would be something that you would definitely want to kick off using the command line. And this area here, under the batch command parameters for the Stratum Connector executable, would be very helpful for you to help, kind of set that command line up. So it kind of goes into all the different parameters that are available. This kind of, this is required. Is it, it'll tell you whether it's required or not. Here's your process type. So here's where you can dictate whether it's a trickle versus a full. So now you can, include that on your command line so that connector does the right process for you. So again, throughout the week, you might have a limited running. Throughout the day, you might have trickles running, and then on the weekend, you're doing a full. You know, it's very typical of what I see out there. More parameters are here for the Trickle. You know, what measure group do I want to update? What year? You know, so again, for these types of things, you know, you're going to want to tell it how to run the Trickle process. And again, here's the type for. Now, if you're specifying the year, Enterprise Edition, you know, is required. So because you're actually processing a particular partition at this point, so you have to have Enterprise to actually specify the year on the Trickle process. Some other parameters are not so important because they're already covered by defaults. You've already specified a lot of this within the interface itself. But if you ever want to change that, you know, through ad hoc processing and whatnot, or anything, or from command line for that matter, you can change them. A lot of these parameters can be changed on the command line, as you can see, which is, again, kind of cool, but you know, you're not going to do that. So you can kind of read through some of these other ones, but the key here is that, you know, the limited option, the limited, or the Trickle parameters are, you know, controlled here and telling, so that if you ever do pursue that, you could set some of that up. Down on the bottom, it's got some examples, so definitely check those out. As a matter of fact, you can copy and paste this, and it'll give you a starting point for your command line, so that you don't have to, you know, build this stuff from scratch. At the end of the day, if you have any questions or need help, contact us. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. You could also engage us in a professional services contract, and we can help you set some of this stuff up for you as well. So, other things to look at, reasons for a process to being stopped or switched. I did like this a lot. Under the advanced concepts, reasons for a process being stopped or switched. This might happen. You know, you run a limited and something never happened. You know, the process never occurred. Why? Well, did you change the name of a dimension or anything else? Because if you're running a limited, it's going to get stopped. And the same for a Trickle. So if that ever occurs, then as you can see, you're going to have some issues there if you're not familiar with what's going on. So I really like this part of the help, because this really kind of identifies, you know, the different situations that can occur and how the different types of processes would react. For instance, if I change the name of a format string of a measure, just something as simple as that, you know, is going to cause the limit and the Trickle to fail. It won't fail, it just won't run. Like I said, the standard will revert back to a full automatically, and then the full is always going to run successfully, typically, even with changes. So, you know, definitely go through this. If you change the name of the measure, you definitely want to run a full. The name of a calculated member, not so stringent. It looks like there's no situations here that occur. Notice that if you run a limited or a Trickle, there is no post-process. So even though this will run successfully, it won't be in your cube unless you run a standard or a full. So I just can't stress enough how important all this is, and for you to kind of know the scenarios here. There's quite a few of them. And so I think that if you kind of go through this, talk about it with your team and discuss strategies about, you know, what different types of process options to pursue, I think you'll find that you can be much more efficient than you are now, perhaps, and more intelligent about how you're processing your nightly cubes for the viewer environment.